Evo, gospodine Vidakoviću, tu ste mi prvi, pa ćemo opet početi s vama.
So, Mr. Vidaković, we will start with you. Central banking in the 21st century is a wide topic. Please refer to the Croatian position, where we have a situation of approaching the Eurozone. So people ask what will be the job of the central banks. They are claiming that they will have even more job, more business than before. So please give us introduction to the central banking with the emphasis on Croatia. A little known fact is I am involved in the monetary policy. This is my basic research topic. I have written a book on that. Central banks will have more job because bureaucracy after every reform has more to do. What is happening in the central banking? Primarily, we have two functions. The first one is the monetary policy. If we introduce euro, it will be transferred to Frankfurt, and we will participate in that. And the second function is supervision of banks. If anything will change and if anything will make sense, then it will be what we were doing in the past, even in the former Yugoslavia, and this is to influence credit policy. So why this mass increase of cash hasn't led to inflation? That money hasn't entered real economy. Why this has happened now? Because the state circumvented the banks. We witnessed in Croatia that the government, because of the measures, was paying out salaries, was actually distributing money that was accumulated for the last 10 years. It was part of the financial sector, and at once it entered the real economy. So the future of the central banking is actually the past. The problems central banks were faced with in the 70s and in the 80s with inflation will be brought back. Inflation will not drop to 1%, rather, for a longer period of time, will be around 2, 3, or 4%. So control of inflation and higher inflation rates is a return to new normal. When it comes to supervision of central banks, this is very important because banks can seriously harm the economy. That happened in 2009. They need to be properly regulated. So the question arises, how to come to the level where saving is equal to the investment. Banks collect deposit. Deposit is given to the companies in the form of lending. That credit is used for buying machinery, so the company can employ one additional worker. This should be ideal future so that credits become investments and that new jobs are created. This is one of the huge challenges for the next decades to come. So we will ask Mr. Lombardi, what is your vision of central banking in the 21st century? What will be the key challenges, and to what extent the central banks will be forced to change their policies?
Thank you. Clearly, I mean, that's a challenging question, but I would respond to your question by saying that essentially there are two areas in which the central bank, I mean, wherever it is, in Croatia, in Frankfurt, in Washington, in Beijing, they will be changing their business model, so to speak. And I would say one area has to do with climate change, and another one has to do with digital currency. So as for climate change, let me dispel any doubt. I'm not advocating for the central bank to fund any of the adjustment or the transition. That's, of course, not the job of the central bank. However, given that climate change is affecting our lives. It is resulting in greater frequency of extreme natural events. We are already seeing that, greater variability in climate. So there are a number of implications. The most important of all is that clearly banks, which are supervised, and of course for which a central bank acts as a lender of last resort, banks are seeing increasing the level of riskiness for their portfolio because maybe they are lending to companies whose assets, whose plants are damaged by climate change, by major flood, by wildfire, whatever. But also because maybe some of the banks have, are exposed to companies that are going to be negatively affected by the transition towards a low carbon economy. So some questions arise, such as, for instance, should the central bank lend to banks that are heavily exposed to fossil fuel companies, and if so, under the same terms as a less riskier bank? Maybe should bank capital requirements be better apportioned to the level of riskiness of a bank? We know that, for instance, the level of capital is apportioned to based on a number of factors. So the question is, to what extent climate change risk should also be apportioned? To what extent central bank supervisors should be conducting stress tests based also on this added dimension of risk? So this is certainly one area where we're going to see lots of developments, and is going to increase, a great deal of attention from central bankers around the world. So this is one dimension. Then the second area where we're going to see, we're already seeing a lot of evolution in terms, at least, of the degree of attention quoted by central bankers on this issue is digital currency. Just as a very quick example, a very quick figure. The Bank of International Settlements in Basel every year conducts a survey. The latest number was that 86% of central banks surveyed acknowledged to be working on some kind of digital currency. Maybe some of them are researching what a digital currency is, might entail. Others are at a relatively advanced pilot stage, so the level of engagement varies. But that said, more than 80% are sort of actively considering digital currency. And what are the drivers for that? Very, very, very briefly, several. Some central banks are sort of driven by the need or the aim of increasing efficiency. For instance, some Scandinavian central banks. Others are driven by the need of supplanting the international role of the dollar in the international monetary system, so there is a more geopolitical dimension into that. Others, because they want to control better illicit activities, tax evasion, and so on and so forth. And then others yet, because there are other central banks who are doing that, so they don't want to lag behind. And so this being the picture, the ECB is also actively considering the digital euro. The Federal Reserve, I think until a year or two ago, the Powell was saying they were not actively considering a digital dollar, where now they've just launched their review, a public consultation, which actually signals a change level of interest on this very issue.
Svakako ćemo ovu raspravu voditi
So this debate will be led in the sphere of digital and green plans. This is the EU policy referring to all the budgets and all the plans, all the roadmaps. But what will happen with interest rates? So Ms. Weronika Dumin could answer that. So there is a ECB policy, Federal Reserve's policy. Their policies are very important. So we very frequently hear that there was never a time when the cash was more easily accessible. Cash is very cheap. What will be the developments in the future regarding this?
Thank you for the question. The economy since the beginning of the 21st century was defined by a lot of crises. For example, Lehman Brothers, technological bubbles, COVID pandemic, a lot of natural crises. Every country suffered this, and every country had to adjust to the new reality after this crisis. Some of countries like Poland, since for the first time since 2012, raised their interest rates. The president of National Bank of Poland announced this week. Some of them, like European Union, lowered their interest rates, and if I am correct, there now is a negative interest rate. What will happen with interest rates will depend on the governments of the countries that are suffering from crisis. They have to adjust to post-pandemic reality, and we will definitely see.
Okay.
Mr. Vidaković, we have heard from the previous panel that these extremely low interest rates could pose a huge threat as well. What is your perception of that situation? And to what extent central banks should be actively involved in that? There are two problems here. The first one is that interest rates that are too low are a problem because banks do not do the borrowing. In order for banks to be involved in the borrowing, in the total mass of the interest rates should have higher revenues than the so-called bad loans. So part of the loans will never be returned, and this is the cost that the bank should sustain, should be able to sustain. So banks should be left with 4% with the total mass of the loans. However, if, as the case in Croatia, interest rate is very low, the borrowing costs are high, and the banks do not want to do the lending. They lend only to the state, and they lend mortgages, and it is very easy to receive a mortgage. The increase of the interest rate should be very favorable, auspicious, to encourage borrowing. This is what happened in the US. When Federal Reserve started to increase interest rates, investments also increased because banks started to be involved in borrowing more. Secondly, usually it is said that the central bank will increase the interest rate. This implies that the central bank leads the economy. We are now at a different stage, at which the economy imposes interest rates to the central bank. So as we have the inflation and the deficit is huge. So it means that the state should be indebted, and if it is indebted, it has to produce a lot of bonds. And then everybody is asking for a higher interest rate. So in the last weeks, we see rise of the interest rates on the long-term state bonds, both in Europe and the US. So the market doesn't believe that inflation is of a short-term nature, despite of all trying to convince us. So we have a reverse situation now. The market is trying to impose to the central bank to rise the interest rate and to prevent the inflation. This happens extremely rarely. For the last time, this happened, something similar in the 80s in the US. And then Paul Walker said, I will prevent inflation at any cost. So this is dangerous. Actually, it is not that dangerous. If you have normal indebtedness of the states, if it comes down, if states are going through fiscal consolidation, you have economic growth. However, if you don't have that, then you have the scenario I explained at the previous panel. So the speculators understand that Greece, Belgium, Italy do not think seriously. They attack their bonds, and then you can have problems at the credit market. And this is what is happening now. The question is whether it will last for the next 6 months or it will vanish. So this is what I'm closely following. Mr. Lombardi, you mentioned in your first presentation that the emphasis is put on green transition, that is to say, on encouraging renewable energy sources. We have a situation that all European banks, in a way, are committed to becoming greener in the next few years. They will invest in green projects, and that these kind of projects will have lower interest rates. Is this appropriate solution, or do you believe that we should come up with a more sustainable perspective by financial institutions?
Well, thank you. So clearly in Europe there is the tendency to sort of look at green policies, green growth policies, as if Europe were a sort of a closed area. I mean, in reality, the implications of climate change should be really managed at a global level. Just to make a very quick example, you know, the European Union has been setting very ambitious goals with clearly, several implications in terms of structural transformations of European industries. And however, you know, China is actually falling behind in terms of its own commitments. So clearly one has to take, has to accept that climate change is a priority, is something that we should be addressing. But the solution should really be, at the global level. In other words, it doesn't make much sense to sort of impose requirements over requirements to, to European companies, while on the other hand, there are other countries that are not, playing on the same field. It's not a level playing field. So, personally, what I would like to see is that, there is indeed a green transition, but the goals, the intermediate milestones, and so on are sort of concerted at the global level, because otherwise we do risk to impose excessive requirements on European companies, which also means, higher unemployment, higher costs of doing business. So, it's going to have all sorts of implications if, on the other hand, there are other countries, and by that I mean systemic countries, that are not really playing by the same rules.
Da se još samo nadovežem na ovo što ste rekli.
Just to add on, is there a risk for Europe, generally speaking, that because of these new green goals, Europe loses some of its influence because of the higher energy efficiency, and at the same time, at the global level, when it comes to climate changes, things will not develop in a desirable way because other countries will not play by the same rules, at least not to the extent that Europe will.
Yeah, I see essentially two aspects on which I'd like to focus on. So one is the need to essentially have a level playing field in this domain, which I don't see yet, and I believe this issue in Europe is played a little bit ideologically. There are some who are in favor, some who are against. I mean, personally, I think, I'm not a scientist, but I take what science tells us, that this is an emergency and we need to act. But exactly because it's a priority, it's an emergency, we need to act globally and not just regionally or nationally. The second aspect I also want to emphasize is that, I remember whenever we were talking about oil dependency, the concern was that Europe was depending on a handful of countries, say 15 countries, whatever, mostly located in North Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia. Here, when we talk about this green transition, we are actually talking about essentially, depending in terms of the provision of batteries, lithium, rare earths, and so on, from one single country. And I think this is a little bit sort of understated, underemphasized in the European debate. By the way, also human rights are not upheld, as we know, and sort of slavery is relied upon, to build batteries and other products that are needed in Europe for that, that are imported in Europe, into Europe for that transition. So I think these are all issues that have to be squared. It has also to be squared with the fact that we can impose all sorts of requirements and restrictions and standards in Europe, but if I buy a product from China that has somehow looser standards, looser carbon fossil standards, okay, that's going to cost less, of course. So I have to find a way to compensate for that. Otherwise, my company, my European companies, our EU companies are not going to play on a level playing field once again.
Gospođo Dumin, da nam malo date iz poljske perspektive.
Ms. Dumin, could you give us a Polish perspective? What is our fate, what is our destiny when it comes to the central banks functioning at the domestic level in one way and as part of the European Union, as part of the global European policies? What are challenges here?
Thank you for the question. Central banks, central bankings are playing a very important role to the nation. National central bankings are more flexible and have more tools to react fast on the crisis the country is facing. Poland, for example, we are not in Eurozone, so we don't work under European central banking. We, due to economic forecast index, we were fourth due to post-pandemic reality, and it's quite a good result for us. And it happened because a lot of procedures we could provide to our citizens very fast.
Thank you. Gospodine Vidakoviću,
Mr. Vidaković, we mentioned at the previous panel the financial crisis in Greece. At that time, it was often said that this umbrella, so-called umbrella of the Eurozone, helped Greece. From your perspective, so the fact that you are within the monetary union, does this help or this reduces the flexibility that central banks might have at a certain point. Maybe I don't know some basic economic figures, but in comparison with 2005, real GDP of Greece is lower by 20%. They have been damaged irreparably. I understand Velimir Šonja, who convinces me that this is great. Why? What this means that they would have dropped by 80% if this hadn't been imposed on them. So this, the story that Eurozone helped Greece, is just a perfect mechanism of hypocrisy that continues on with this story of green energy. I'm fascinated by the fact that the same people who allowed the stock market bubble, who allowed for the leverage of banks to be 30-1, who allowed for mortgages all over the world, who allowed for the banking system to collapse in 2009, the same people who allowed for the breakdown of a certain economy, for Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian economies to be damaged, who allowed for zero interest rates, and who turned countries into those who are dependent on cheap money. So the same people who allowed in Croatia for Agrokor credit loans in Swiss francs, and they had tools to stop this. These same people said that this was impossible at that time, but now they're saying we have tools to stimulate green economy. How come they didn't have tools to stop loans in Swiss francs? I would like you to ask this Boris Vučemilović. You're talking about the role of the central bank. Yes, all of a sudden the central bank can impact the investment in green economy. How come they couldn't have an impact on loans in Swiss francs, on the real estate bubble in the US, using the same tools that Mr. Domenico was mentioning of capital adequacy? They could have stopped these bubbles, but they did not do that because it was more profitable. It was not profitable. It was unpopular. And now everyone talks about green things. Now this is very popular. It is very important to be green, go green. And the same people who allowed for the indebtment of 120% of GDP, dependency on tourism, Agrokor, loans in Swiss francs, these same people are now allowing you to build green lawns. And no one asks the same governor and his clique, no one asked them, what are you doing? This green energy, this is hypocrisy. Even Mr. Domenico said this is the only thing that can be done, and this has to be done not at the Croatian or European level, but at the global level. It is the only game in town, it is said in English. But I come from Lika, and we remember, you know, and I haven't forgotten about the things that the central bank allowed to do. You have a problem conceptually with this green story, or you just think that it is not sustainable, or you have a problem with people who are promoting this story and you don't think that they took good decisions 10 years ago. I have a problem with people who are selling hypocrisy for their own seats, comfortable seats, because I'm not against green energy, of course not. I don't want to live in a desert on a destroyed planet. Why would we pay for electricity if we can get free energy from the sun? Why wouldn't we use renewable energy sources? Why wouldn't we drive electric cars? Why wouldn't we use funds that we use for weapons and such stupid things, for example, to colonize Mars? So these are serious things. Why wouldn't we be happy? But we cannot be happy with people who brought us at this point. Someone has to state this. Mr. Lombardi, do you have some reaction to this? Or should we move on to digital cryptocurrencies?
No, look, I mean, really, it's. I think there is a little bit of an ideological approach to this green transition, and as it has been said, this is really a priority, but a priority for all of us. I don't think that Croatia or Italy can make a difference into this debate. It has to be a globally concerted effort, and one has to pay attention at not imposing too strict requirements on the companies or one economy if there is a no level playing field. Otherwise, we are not going to improve the standards of our planet, but we are just hampering the competitiveness of our national economy, be that of Croatia or Italy or another third country. But I was curious, was interested in your question on digital currencies, if I may.
To je zapravo zanimljivo.
It is interesting from what we can hear from central banks. In most countries, there's a great skepticism in terms of what has become a global phenomenon, and those are cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. Is there, in your opinion, fear that in this part of banking, part of significance will be lost, or the bankers are afraid that they might be facing a global bubble of potential risk because this is still unregulated market and people have lost a lot of money?
Yeah, so I think your question is very crucial because clearly whenever we talk about digital currency, somehow this is sort of associated to cryptocurrencies, and actually, what they share is, the digital environment. They are both digital assets in their own way. However, they are also very different because the digital currency is a liability of the central bank. It could be paper in the fiat sort of regime, but in the digital format, would be a digital liability. But it would be a liability of the central bank. In the cryptocurrency world, there is anonymity, while in the digital currency setting, the looser standard that we see is sort of controllable anonymity. In other words, it's not the same kind of anonymity we see in the cryptocurrency world, and therefore, on some dimensions, these two notions couldn't be more different. Mm-hmm. We have also to think, about a number of advantages that digital currency, could bring about. Clearly, more inclusion, could be more efficient to manage, and on the other hand, it's something that has never been introduced on a global scale. I mean, meaning, going beyond a microstate, okay, a micro sort of setting. And the only systemic economy that is introducing it to some extent is China. They are at a very advanced pilot stage, and by the time of the next Winter Olympics, that is in February of next year, they plan clearly a rollout also to foreigners. Will provide a platform, a stage, in which clearly to present this new project. That said, with all new things, I think there are a number of strengths, advantages. On the other hand, one has to be cautious. It's not perhaps surprising that the central banks issuing major currencies like the ECB or the Fed have been quite cautious on that for good reasons. So I think we have to be we have to study, we have to be careful, we have to discuss. But that said, I don't think that we can rule out at some stage, the introduction of digital currencies in whatever format. Clearly, the sort of the design that is sort of palatable to Western economies has still to be crafted.
According to the signals that come from various countries, it seems that the introduction of these digital currencies is only a matter of time. In your opinion, what are the key benefits or key motives or reasons that will be brought about with their introduction?
Yeah, there are, depending on where you sit in the world, there are, a number of advantages that central banks or, people, investors, politicians are eyeing. So, if you sit somewhere in China, essentially through the digital yuan, you are implicitly setting up a new payment infrastructure. So you can compete on a more effective basis with the dollar. And also think of possible sanctions that the US or the Western world can impose on China, maybe, sort of threatening or sanctioning access to the global payment infrastructures. Well, with the digital yuan, that would not be sort of feasible or credible anymore. Other countries, like, for instance, Sweden, they are pursuing this project because they want to increase the efficiency of payment. They want to just bring more digitalization. And as a matter of fact, also following up, on the pandemic, on the digitalization we have all been exposed to while we were confined in our homes. Clearly, this digital currency momentum, is building up. As I was saying before, it is really the news of the latest few days. The chairman of the Federal Reserve launched a review of the digital currency, of the digital dollar, in order to gather, opinions, comments from the public, and I think, this gives you the measure of that something is changing. So it's not going to happen perhaps next year, but it's not going to happen in 50 years either.
Mrs. Dumin, in what way can central banks take a stance towards these challenges? Very many things become decentralized, if you like, unregulated. So can central banks have an impact, or they have to find a niche in order to fight this?
Central banking is important, and national and European one too. In my opinion, central banking won't lose their power soon. They have tools to provide stability or safetyness for the citizens. What is interesting is in the near future we will see in what the central banks will invest for the reserves. For now, I think it won't change in the near future is the gold, and even Poland is planning to buy 100 tons in the near future. I think the gold reserves from central bankings represents validity and safetyness and stability for the future of countries.
Thank you. This is interesting. The position of gold, Mr. Vidakovic. What will be its role, and how do central banks position in this respect? The fact is that, in the past 10 years, this money produced by central bank has grown immensely, and today this is based on bonds. Someone mentioned Japan. They have bonds, but they also have stocks. So central bank in Japan, they buy stocks. The problem is whether the people trust them. We sold our gold as a country, and this was a mistake, in my opinion. And central banks have to have a lot of gold and a lot of silver and a lot of other currencies and other bonds so that they can provide itself stability. Because if you only have state bonds, and if you're slightly unstable and a large country, then you have a problem. If I were running Croatian Central Bank, I would increase, I would buy gold, I would buy silver. Paradoxically, I would buy several pieces of Bitcoin. I think our money is stable because it is based on several things. And the thing we have with digital currencies and cryptocurrencies and various simple forms of payment, they are shifting this focus from central banking money. And this is where central banks must evolve, and they must retain trust of people in their own money, irrespective whether we're talking about Croatian kuna, European euro, or American dollar. This perspective is quite interesting in relation to the Croatian National Bank's view of cryptocurrencies. They are saying that this is a very risky investment procedure, and we must deviate from this. We must move away from this, and they are far from buying bitcoins or any other cryptocurrencies. Do you think that they are afraid that they might face the scenario with cryptocurrencies as we face the scenario with Swiss francs, that at a certain point people might be affected by poor transactions, and then they should then ask for help from the state, and then the guilty will be the central bank. But you have to, first of all, follow certain trends. I first heard of Bitcoin when it was at 0 or minus 10 cents in 2010, and my friend told me it will go up to $1,000. I said, no way. Personally, I never traded in cryptocurrencies because of this, because I don't want to wake up and realize that something dropped by 10% in 5 minutes. But this blockchain technology, this new digital technology, is something that, as we heard from colleagues, everyone is exploring, so we should do it as well. And the stance of our central bank is that always the same. We know nothing, we cannot do anything. And then all of a sudden, when it comes to green economy, they can do everything. You think that there should be a balanced approach between these two things? You're saying that they're showing too much initiative on one hand and too little initiative on the other. They are convincing us that we have to have a stable exchange rate and no other option is possible. How come then Serbia has targeted inflation? How come Serbia has stable exchange rate? Our economists say that the central bank cannot affect interest rate. How come Serbia can do that? How come Slovenia can do that? And Slovenia is much smaller before they joined the EU. So you have small countries that have a completely different monetary policy. Why? Do you know why they can do it? Because their governors are governors who have spent their entire lives dealing with monetary policy. Our last 3 governors, one was expert in static transport, and I'm sure no one knows what that is. If you know, that is parking, if you want to know. Other is expert in central planning and economic expert in demography. They cannot run central bank. We have a governor that is expert. If we had a governor that was expert in monetary policy, then we might innovate central banking. Boris Vučemilović is professor where? At the Faculty of Economy. And if you answer this question as to his background, then you know why we don't have innovation.
Kako vidite isto da se možda
Mr. Lombardi, how do you perceive the issue of the basic ECB policies? In which direction its functioning will go when it comes to interest rates and fostering economy through quantitative easing? Are these processes which are here on the long term?
What we know is that first of all, the emergency pandemic response is going to last at least until next March. Probably at the December meeting of the ECB Governing Council will be in a position to better assess what the ECB stance will be, but the indications are that it will be revised. As a matter of fact, the ECB has already scaled down the level of monthly purchases of government bonds, and it may continue to be doing so, especially if the inflation data as well as the GDP data continue in the direction that we have seen and we have discussed this morning. That said, so we're going to see more price variability, higher inflation compared to what we have observed over the latest decade. But I wouldn't say that in the Eurozone inflation is going to be out of control. I believe the ECB has all the ammunition to ensure that over the medium term, inflation is going to fluctuate around the 2% target.
Gospođo Dumin, čuli smo zapravo da ono što će
Ms. Dumin, we have heard that what for the central banks will be very important in the upcoming period is to adjust to the changes. Once the changes gain the speed central banks are not used to, then those changes will have to be very fast. So are European central banks well adjusted to those changes?
Members of the European Union are very diversified. There are a lot of tourist countries, industry countries, big one, very small one. And it depends. For now, European central banking should improve regulation to adjust and be more active, can react fast to any crisis one or a group of members are facing in the same time.
Thank you. Evo imamo još otprilike da vidim samo da li ima možda neko pitanje iz publike.
Other questions from the audience?
Nema? Hvala. Evo
No.
možda još samo
So maybe conclusions, final thoughts. Mr. Vidaković, you said Croatia is in a specific situation because the role of the ECB will change by entry into the Eurozone. How do you see their role in the upcoming period? So we will be sitting at a huge table together with other members. What kind of impact shall we have? Probably the small one, because we are a small country. The person looking at you here is Johnny Cash, and he was a rebel. So he reminds me of an old proverb, when freedom becomes outlawed, only outlaws will be free. So the time ahead of us is the time when we will have to stand up and say the time is now. So initiative for referendum is a good one, because we have to move regardless of our stance. for or against. Otherwise, we are in a standstill. So when the freedom becomes outlawed, then you have to become outlaw in order to be free. So, Mr. Lombardi, do we trust central banking that in terms of that they will make decisions which will bring prosperity and well-being for the states and for the citizens? Is this trust present?
So I think this really compounds two questions, because when we talk about the ECB, we are talking about a multinational central bank. So compromise is in the order. It's a complex decision-making, as you were pointing out. But in a way, it also gives you a sense of the challenge that European countries are managing. So, so far, I think that the ECB has shown, a sufficient degree of flexibility in adapting. And as I said, if there is a price surge above the benchmark, above the target levels recently set by the ECB itself, I think the ECB will manage, to provide, us with a stable inflation path over the medium term.
Gospođo Dumin, za kraj.
And Ms. Dumin, finally, you in Poland have decided that Eurozone is not the best solution for you. Do citizens of Poland trust the central bank in its own state?
I think at this moment, yes, of course, but well, it could change any minute now. We will see in the future. Maybe we will gain an opportunity to have a referendum too. So we will see. Yeah.
I thank to my panelists, and now, finally, we will give the floor to Mr. Witold Szewil, Executive Director of the New Direction. So please, you have the floor and address the audience and give us your final speech.